Red emergency lights flashed across the bridge of the HMS Prudence as Captain James watched the massive swarm of enemy ships approach on the main display. His hands gripped the command chair's armrests, but his voice remained steady as he addressed his crew. "Status report," he called out, his eyes fixed on the growing cloud of hostile vessels. "Sir, we count over 3,000 swarm ships approaching," Lieutenant Rogers reported from the sensor station. "The Rock Warriors and Steel Dragons are moving to engage." James nodded as he watched their alien ally ships charge forward. The Rock Warriors' massive granite-like vessels and the Steel Dragons' sleek warships moved aggressively toward the enemy. Their commanders' voices crackled over the Alliance communications channel. "Watch how real warriors fight, humans," boomed Commander Stone of the Rock Warriors. "Today we show these insects the meaning of true courage." James ignored the taunt. He'd heard it all before. Instead, he focused on the sensor readings streaming across his personal display. Something about the swarm's movement pattern caught his attention. "Communications, patch me through to both fleets," he ordered. "Allied commanders, our sensors detect unusual formation changes in the swarm. I strongly suggest we fall back and regroup." The response was immediate and predictable. "Typical human cowardice," sneered Admiral Crystal of the Steel Dragons. "They face us, we fight. That is the warrior's way." James watched as both alien fleets accelerated toward the enemy. He'd seen this before, and he knew what would happen next. His fingers danced across his command console, recording every detail of the swarm's movements. "All hands, battle stations," he announced across the ship. "Prepare for emergency maneuvers." The swarm struck like a tidal wave of metal and energy. Their smaller ships flowed around the Allied vessels in complex patterns, while larger carrier types released clouds of fighter craft. James watched as the Rock Warriors' heavy ships opened fire with their main guns, their energy beams cutting through the first wave of enemies. But something was different this time. The swarm wasn't breaking against their defenses like usual. Instead, they were— "Sir," Rogers called out, "the swarm ships are linking together. They're forming some kind of network." James leaned forward, his eyes widening as he saw it. The smaller swarm ships were physically connecting to each other, creating massive living walls of metal that started to enclose the Allied fleets. "Allied commanders, you're being surrounded," he transmitted. "Break off the attack immediately." "Silence, human," came the response. "We have them right where we want them." James watched in horror as the trap closed. The swarm ships had created a massive sphere around the Allied fleets, their linked bodies generating some kind of energy field. Inside, the Rock Warriors and Steel Dragons found their weapons becoming less and less effective. "Energy readings are off the charts," Rogers reported. They're draining power from the Allied ships." "Record everything," James ordered. "Every detail, every pattern. And plot us a retreat course, maximum speed." As the Prudence turned away from the battle, angry transmissions filled their communications. "Cowards, you abandon your allies. This is why humans cannot be trusted." James kept his eyes on the sensor data as his ship accelerated away. The swarm's new tactic was devastating, but it had to have a weakness. Everything did. And sometimes, the only way to find that weakness was to survive to study it. "Sir," his communications officer said quietly, "the Steel Dragon's flagship, it's gone silent. The Rock Warriors are reporting massive casualties." James nodded grimly. "Send a priority transmission to Earth Command. Tell them we have critical combat data regarding a new swarm tactic. And send our condolences to the Allies. Tell them we'll make this retreat count." As the Prudence jumped to faster than light speed, James downloaded all the sensor data to his personal device. The swarm's new linking behavior, the energy field, the power drain, it was all here. Others would call this a cowardly retreat, but he knew better. This wasn't an escape. This was reconnaissance, and somewhere in all this data was the key to defeating humanity's greatest enemy. The next time they met the swarm, they'd be ready. Sometimes, the bravest thing a warrior could do was run away and live to fight another day. The great meeting hall of Earth Command buzzed with angry voices. Representatives from 12 alien species had gathered for an emergency council, and none of them looked happy. Giant screens on the walls showed the devastating losses from the recent battle. Captain James stood at attention before the council, his face calm despite the hostile stares. Behind him, Dr. Miller, Earth's lead scientist on swarm behavior, adjusted her glasses nervously. 300 ships lost, thundered the new rock warrior commander, his stone-like skin gleaming under the lights. 2,000 warriors dead, and you humans dare to call this meeting. Admiral West of Earth Command raised her hand for silence. We called this meeting because Captain James gathered crucial intelligence during the battle. Dr. Miller has analyzed the data, and her findings are interesting. Dr. Miller stepped forward, carrying her tablet. Her voice shook slightly, but grew stronger as she spoke. The swarm's new linking behavior isn't just a tactical choice, she explained, bringing up 3D images of the battle. Look at these energy patterns. When they connect, they're not just forming a barrier. They're creating a living communication network. The Steel Dragon representative, his metallic scales reflecting the light, laughed sharply. We did not come here for a science lesson. We came to plan our revenge attack. Please, Dr. Miller continued, this is important. The swarm doesn't just fight. They learn. They adapt. Each battle makes them stronger because they share information through their network. But this new linking behavior shows something else. She zoomed in on a particular section of the battle footage. They're not just sharing information anymore. They're sharing energy, power, becoming a single giant organism. That's why your weapons stopped working. They were spreading the damage across their entire network. The alien representatives shifted uncomfortably. Captain James stepped forward. But there's more, he said. Dr. Miller, show them what happens when the network is disrupted. The scientist nodded and played another clip. It showed a small section of linked swarm ships taking a direct hit. For a moment, their formation wavered. There, Dr. Miller pointed. See that energy spike? When even a small part of their network breaks, it sends a shock through their entire system. They're vulnerable during these moments. So what? Growled the rock warrior commander. We hit them hard enough. Everything becomes vulnerable. No, James said firmly. We've been fighting them wrong. Hitting them head-on just gives them time to adapt and strengthen their network. But if we could disrupt their communication pattern, Dr. Miller. She brought up a complex diagram. The swarm's network has a rhythm to it. A pulse. Like a heartbeat. If we could interrupt that rhythm in just the right way. Enough. The Steel Dragon representative stood up. First, you run from battle. Now you waste our time with talk of rhythms and pulses. The swarm killed our warriors. They must pay in blood. Admiral West's voice cut through the growing noise. They will, but not through blind revenge. Captain James, Dr. Miller, continue your research. Find us a way to break their network. As the alien representatives stormed out, James and Dr. Miller shared a look. They knew they were right. The swarm's greatest strength, their ability to join together, could become their greatest weakness. They just needed time to prove it. They'll never agree to help us, will they? Dr. Miller asked quietly. James watched the angry aliens leave. They don't need to. Not yet. Keep studying those energy patterns. I'll talk to Admiral West about running some tests. What kind of tests? A small smile crossed James's face. The kind that looks like running away. Sometimes, Doctor, the best way to learn about your enemy is to let them think they're winning. As they left the meeting hall, neither of them noticed the young Bugwalker representative lingering behind, watching them with all four of its eyes. Perhaps it thought, these humans weren't as foolish as they seemed. Operation Grasshopper. Admiral West raised an eyebrow as she looked at the battle plan on her screen. You want to name our major military operation after an insect. Captain James stood firm. Grasshoppers jump away from danger, Admiral. But they always land in a better position to strike back. 2 weeks had passed since the council meeting. James and Dr. Miller had worked day and night, studying the swarm's patterns. Now they were ready to present their plan to Earth Command. Dr. Miller stepped forward, bringing up a hologram of their proposed battle formation. The key is synchronized retreats, she explained. Each time we pull back, we leave behind special devices that interfere with the swarm's network. Like dropping breadcrumbs? Asked Admiral West. More like leaving behind tiny chaos makers, James said. Each device broadcasts a signal that matches the swarm's communication frequency, but slightly wrong, like someone singing off-key in their hive mind. The bug walker representative, who had asked to join the meeting, clicked its mandibles thoughtfully. You seek to create discord in their unity. Clever. Other officers in the room studied the plan. The hologram showed human ships performing complex retreat patterns, each movement precisely timed. We'll need the entire human fleet, James continued. Small, fast ships that can strike and retreat quickly. No large battleships. They're too slow, too easy to trap. Admiral West frowned. The other species won't like this. They'll say we're abandoning the front lines. Let them, Dr. Miller said with unexpected firmness. We've mapped the swarm's energy patterns. Their network has weak points, moments when their ships disconnect and reconnect. That's when we strike. The hologram changed, showing waves of small ships darting in and out of the swarm's formations. Each retreat left behind a small blinking device. The interference builds up slowly, Dr. Miller explained. One device doesn't do much, but hundreds, thousands, all broadcasting slightly different discordant signals. Their network won't be able to maintain stability. The bug walker stepped closer to the hologram, like water wearing away stone, not through force, but through patience and persistence. Exactly, James nodded. We're not trying to outfight them. We're trying to make them fight themselves. Admiral West stood up and walked around the hologram, studying it from all angles. How long to prepare the fleet? 2 weeks to refit our ships and train the crews, James replied. The hard part will be timing. Every retreat has to be perfect. Too early, and we won't place the devices correctly. Too late, and we'll have more dead heroes, the Admiral finished. No, we've had enough of those. She turned to face them. You have your authorization. Begin training immediately. But remember, we can't tell our allies. They'll try to stop us. Just then, the bug walker made a strange clicking sound. Perhaps not all allies. It raised one of its 4 arms. My people understand patience. We understand the power of small things working together. If you would accept our help. James and Dr. Miller shared a surprised look. The bug walkers were one of the smallest allied species, their ships often overlooked in major battles. But their vessels were fast, agile. Perfect for Operation Grasshopper, James said with a smile. Then it settled. Admiral West declared, Captain James, you'll lead the operation. Dr. Miller, keep working on those interference devices. And she looked at the bug walker. Welcome to the team. As they left the command center, Dr. Miller caught up with James. Do you really think this will work? She asked quietly. James watched as human crews already began modifying their ships in the massive space dock below. It has to, he said, because if it doesn't, there won't be anything left to save. Above them, the stars twinkled quietly, hiding the growing swarm that waited in the darkness. But for the first time since the war began, humanity had a plan. Not a plan of glory or honor, but something better. A plan that might actually work. Grasshopper Squad 1. Execute Jump Pattern Delta. Captain James's voice crackled through the command channel. The bridge of the Prudence hummed with energy as 50 small ships moved in perfect formation. Operation Grasshopper had begun. The swarm didn't know what to make of these new tactics. Their massive fleet pushed forward, trying to form their usual network, but the human ships kept dancing away. Each retreat seemed random, cowardly, exactly what everyone expected from humans. But it wasn't random at all. "Drop points confirmed," reported Lieutenant Rogers from his station. "Interference devices activated." On the main screen, tiny dots of light winked into existence behind their retreat path. Dr. Miller, now stationed permanently on the Prudence, watched her readings carefully. "Network disruption at 2%, she announced. "It's working, but we need more coverage." The bug-walker ships moved like shadows through space, their dark hulls nearly invisible against the backdrop of stars. They followed the humans' retreat patterns perfectly, dropping their own devices in precisely calculated positions. "Swarm ships attempting to link," called out Rogers. "They're trying to form their energy network." James leaned forward in his command chair. This was the moment they'd trained for. "All ships, execute pattern Omega. Hit and fade, just like we practiced." The human fleet split into 3 groups, each attacking from a different angle. They fired their weapons directly at the points where swarm ships were trying to connect. Not trying to destroy them, just disrupting their linking attempts. "Network disruption at 5%, Dr. Miller reported. Her voice held barely controlled excitement. "The frequency interference is building up." On the main screen, they could see some swarm ships moving erratically. The usually perfect formation showed small gaps, tiny imperfections in their living network. "Incoming transmission from the Steel Dragons," the communications officer announced. "They're demanding to know why we're not holding the line." James ignored them. "Grasshopper Squad 2, begin your attack run. Bug-walker allies, maintain your shadow positions." More devices activated in space, each one broadcasting its chaotic signal into the swarm's network. The enemy ships began to show more signs of confusion. Some clusters broke apart and reformed, trying to find stable connections. "Network disruption at 12%. Dr. Miller's hands flew across her console. "The cascade effect is starting. Each broken link creates more interference." Suddenly, a group of swarm ships broke formation completely. They spun in space, their movements uncoordinated and wild. "That's it." James stood up. "All ships, focus fire on the disconnected units. Quick strikes only. Don't stay in range." Human and bug-walker ships darted in, their weapons blazing. The confused swarm ships, cut off from their network, couldn't coordinate their defenses. One after another, they fell. "Steel Dragon fleet is moving to engage," Rogers reported. "They're trying to turn this into a direct battle." "Let them," James said calmly. "We stick to our plan. Grasshopper Squad 3, begin your attack pattern. Keep dropping those devices." Hour after hour, the battle continued. The human ships never stopped moving, never tried to hold their ground. Each retreat left more interference devices. Each attack targeted the weakest points in the swarm's network. "Network disruption at 25%, Dr. Miller announced. "We're reaching critical levels. Their whole command structure is starting to break down." James watched as more swarm ships lost their coordination. The mighty enemy fleet was starting to look less like an unstoppable force and more like a confused mass of individual ships. "Send word to Earth Command," he ordered. "Tell them Phase 1 is successful. The death of 1,000 cuts has begun." Dr. Miller looked up from her readings. "They're actually doing it," she said softly. "They're tearing themselves apart from the inside." James nodded. Sometimes the smallest cuts cause the most damage, especially when you know exactly where to make them. As they watched, another cluster of swarm ships broke formation, their networked consciousness drowning in a sea of carefully calculated chaos. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, victory seemed possible. And it would come not through courage or strength, but through patience, precision, and the willingness to retreat. Dr. Miller burst onto the bridge of the Prudence, her tablet computer clutched tightly in her hands. "Captain, You need to see this." Captain James turned from the tactical display where he'd been studying the latest battle reports. 3 weeks had passed since Operation Grasshopper began, and the swarm was acting stranger every day. "What have you found?" he asked as Dr. Miller connected her tablet to the main screen. The display filled with complex wave patterns. To most of the bridge crew, they looked like random lines. But to Dr. Miller, they told an amazing story. "Their network isn't just breaking down," she explained, her eyes bright with excitement. "It's evolving, trying to adapt. But that's making things even worse for them." Lieutenant Rogers looked up from his sensor station. "Worse how?" Dr. Miller pointed to specific patterns on the screen. "See these spikes? Every time they try to strengthen their network against our interference, they have to make new connections. But our devices are affecting these new patterns even more strongly than the old ones." James smiled slowly. "They're trapped. If they don't adapt, our interference tears them apart. If they do adapt, they tear themselves apart," Dr. Miller finished. "And there's more. Look at this sector." The screen shifted to show a massive cluster of swarm ships. Their movements were jerky, uncoordinated. Some ships crashed into each other, while others fired weapons randomly into space. "Total network failure in that group," Rogers reported. "They're completely cut off from the main swarm." Just then, the communications officer called out, "Sir, priority message from the Steel Dragon fleet." "Put it through," James ordered, expecting more complaints about human cowardice. But the metallic voice that came through was different this time. Uncertain, almost respectful. "Human Captain," the Steel Dragon commander said. We request information about your interference devices." James raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what changed your mind?" "We have observed the swarm's weakness, their confusion. Perhaps there is wisdom in your method of combat." Before James could respond, another call came in, this time from the Rock Warriors. "The enemy breaks against empty space," the Rock Warrior commander boomed. "Their mighty network falls to invisible weapons. Humans, you must share your strategy." Dr. Miller looked at James with a grin. "Should we tell them it was their mockery that gave us the idea? That by calling us cowards, they helped us find the perfect way to fight?" James shook his head, smiling. "Let's not rub it in. Rogers, send the tactical data to both fleets. And get me Earth Command. It's time for Phase 2. "Phase 2?" Dr. Miller asked. "We've proven the concept works. Now we scale it up. Way up." He turned to address the entire bridge. "Send word to all Grasshopper squads. Tell the Bug Walkers to prepare their entire fleet. We're going to turn this sector of space into one giant disruption field." The bridge erupted into activity. Officers relayed orders, technicians adjusted equipment, and through it all, Dr. Miller watched her wave patterns change. "Look," she said softly, pointing to a new pattern forming. "Their whole network is trying to compensate, trying to find a way around our interference. But they can't. They've never faced anything like this before." James watched the patterns with her. "They'd never faced humans before. Not really. They thought we were cowards because we retreated. They never understood that we were studying them, learning them, finding their weakness. And now they're learning something every human knows. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is run away. But they're learning it too late." On the main screen, more and more swarm ships lost their coordination. The mighty network that had made them unstoppable was becoming their greatest weakness. The pattern was clear now. Victory was no longer just possible. It was inevitable. And it had all started with a cowardly retreat. The training room on Earth's main space station was packed. Alien commanders from every allied species crowded around holographic displays as human officers explained the basics of Operation Grasshopper. "The key is timing," Captain James explained, pointing to a simulation of ships performing a retreat pattern. "You don't just run away. You retreat with purpose." The Rock Warrior commander raised his massive stone hand. But our ships are too heavy for such quick movements. That's why we've modified the strategy. Dr. Miller cut in. She brought up a new display showing different ship types. Heavy ships like yours will form the anvil. Faster ships will be the hammer. Together, we'll crush the swarm between us. In space, the combined fleet practiced the new formations. Huge rock warrior vessels held position while smaller ships darted around them, all dropping interference devices in carefully planned patterns. Network disruption at 40%. A technician called out during their latest battle simulation. The Steel Dragon ships, their metallic hulls gleaming, performed a perfect tactical retreat. Well done, James called over the command channel. You're starting to think like cowards. Surprisingly, laughter echoed back from the alien commanders. What had once been an insult was now becoming a point of pride. The Bugwalker representative clicked its mandibles happily. The rhythm of retreat and attack, like a dance that brings death to our enemies. Dr. Miller watched from her new command center, where banks of computers tracked the swarm's failing network patterns. The disruption is spreading faster than ever, she reported. Their attempts to adapt are only making things worse. Time for the real thing, James announced. All fleets, battle positions. The largest combined fleet in the history of the Alliance moved into formation. But unlike before, there were no arguments about honor or courage. Every ship, every commander knew their part in the dance. The swarm appeared right on schedule, their ships trying to form their usual network. But this time, something was different. They're moving slower, Rogers reported from his sensor station on the Prudence. The interference is affecting them before they even connect. All the devices we've left in this sector, Dr. Miller explained. They've created a background disruption. Their network is fighting itself before it even forms. James watched as the rock warrior ships moved into position, forming a wall of stone-like hulls. The steel dragons and bugwalkers waited behind them, ready to strike. Now, James ordered. The rock warriors opened fire with their heavy weapons, not trying to destroy the swarm, but herding them into position. The swarm ships tried to link up, to form their energy network. Disruption at 60%. Dr. Miller called out. They can't maintain stable connections. Second wave, begin attack runs. Human ships darted forward, followed by bugwalkers and steel dragons. They struck at the swarm's weak points, dropped more interference devices, then retreated behind the rock warrior line. Again and again, the pattern repeated. The swarm tried to adapt, tried to form new types of connections. But each adaptation was met with a perfectly timed retreat, leaving behind more chaos-bringing devices. Disruption at 75%. Dr. Miller's voice was triumphant. Their entire command structure is collapsing. Across every channel, alien commanders reported success. Ships that had once charged blindly forward now performed elegant retreat maneuvers. The mighty swarm, which had seemed unstoppable, was being taken apart piece by piece. Look at them run, the rock warrior commander rumbled happily. Who are the cowards now? James smiled as he watched another section of the swarm break apart. Remember this day, he said to all ships. This is the day we learn that true victory doesn't come from standing your ground. It comes, Dr. Miller finished, from knowing when to step back and let your enemy defeat themselves. The battle continued, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The age of the swarm was ending, brought down not by courage or strength, but by the patient, calculated retreats of those they had once mocked as cowards. The massive view screen in Earth Command's central hall showed thousands of swarm ships drifting powerless in space. Their once perfect network was completely shattered, leaving them as lifeless as scattered leaves after a storm. Network disruption at 100%. Dr. Miller announced to the gathered representatives of every allied species. The swarm's hive mind has totally collapsed. They can't reform their connections anymore. Captain James stood beside her at the main podium. Behind them, the Bugwalker representative clicked happily while the Rock Warrior and Steel Dragon commanders nodded in approval. The last swarm ship lost contact with their network 3 hours ago, James reported. For the first time since this war began, we're detecting no signs of coordinated swarm activity anywhere in our space. Admiral West stepped forward. The question is, what do we do with them now? The hall fell silent. On the screen, individual swarm ships floated helplessly. Without their network, they were just machines, no more threatening than space debris. The Rock Warrior commander stood up, his stone-like form towering over the others. In the past, we would have destroyed them all, called it a glorious victory. He paused, looking at the human officers. But perhaps we have learned there are better ways. The swarm ships are advanced technology, the Steel Dragon representative added. If we could study them, understand them better. Like we studied their network, Dr. Miller said excitedly. Think what we could learn about their communication systems, their energy technology. James raised his hand for attention. More importantly, think what we've already learned. About ourselves. About fighting smarter, not harder. The Bug Walker representative stepped forward, its 4 eyes gleaming. About the strength that comes from stepping back, from watching, from understanding. Admiral West nodded. Then it's decided. We'll recover what swarm ships we can. Study them, learn from them, and make sure they can never threaten us again. The main doors of the hall opened, and workers began bringing in tables filled with food and drinks. The victory celebration was about to begin. But first, Admiral West had one more task. Captain James, she called out. Step forward. James stood at attention as the Admiral approached him. For extraordinary service, for innovative tactical thinking, and for teaching us all a valuable lesson about the true nature of courage, I hereby promote you to Admiral. The hall erupted in cheers. Even the Rock Warriors stamped their feet in approval, the sound like boulders falling. Thank you, James said simply. Then he turned to address the gathered allies. But the real credit goes to everyone who was willing to learn, to change, to see that sometimes what looks like cowardice is actually wisdom. Dr. Miller stepped up beside him. And to prove that the strongest enemy can be defeated not through force, but through patience, the Bug Walker added. Through observation, said the Steel Dragon. Through clever thinking, rumbled the Rock Warrior. James looked out at the faces of all the species that had come together, learned to work together, learned to retreat together. The swarm thought they were unstoppable because they were connected. But we proved that our different ways of thinking, our ability to adapt and change, make us stronger than any hive mind. Admiral West raised her glass. To victory through prudence. To victory through prudence. The hall echoed back. Later, as the celebration continued, James stood by a window looking out at the stars. Dr. Miller joined him. What are you thinking about? She asked. About how far we've come, he replied. From being mocked as cowards to teaching battle strategy to the entire alliance. And what's the most important lesson? James smiled. That true courage isn't about never retreating. It's about knowing why you retreat and using every step back to plan your next step forward. Above them, the stars shone peacefully. Somewhere out there, the remaining swarm ships drifted, powerless and alone, a reminder that the greatest victories don't always go to the strongest or the bravest. Sometimes they go to those who are simply wise enough to know when to run away.